Hey guys, what's going on? Garrett with Executive Training Group, and today I am talking about this scope right here in particular, which is an EOTech Vudu 1-8, and this is not necessarily a review, but this is why this optic works well on this setup and what I like about it, some of the end user features, okay? So I'm not going to get all lost in the details of like, oh, they had frogs from the Amazon that they extracted venom from and they coated the lenses in it so it never fogs, or no, I don't technical stuff that way. I'm going to steer clear of that because a lot of it I just frankly don't know, but as an end user, I know some of the things that are really, really important to shooting performance and capability of the optic. And that's what I want to share with you guys. That's a big part of education, is you guys understanding why and understanding how to make decisions for yourself and picking out a rifle or scope or optic or any piece of equipment, is getting some of this data and going, oh wow, that makes sense, that is useful, I like that thing, or I don't care about that, or that matters to me or it doesn't. That's the idea, okay? So without further ado, the first thing we're going to talk about is this scope, and I'm going to kind of wade through some of the options, okay? So what we are talking about is a low variable power optic, okay? This can be anything from 1 power to 10, right? 1 to 4, 1 to 6, 1 to 8. It is kind of the carbine setup optic, if you will. It's basically an evolution of the ACOG, the ACOG being a very beatable, just robust optic that the Army has used. I have a lot of time behind the ACOG. This kind of came from the competition world and became very popular as another option from the ACOG. Now I want to say right off the bat, I love the ACOG. I think it's great, but I still tend to lean a little bit more towards these, and I'm going to share with you why. Okay, so first things first. What type of rifle would I want to put this optic on, right? What type of rifle, deems a magnified optic? Really, it just depends on what the use is, okay? I wouldn't say that I want to throw this on a 10.5-inch AR, probably not. But there are very specific uses where that might be useful for you, whether it's space and confinement, and you might feel like I have to take a really precise shot. This could aid in that versus a magnifier or something like that, or just the way your eye perceives it, all right? So the main thing is, just have a good philosophy of use behind why you're slapping this on here. Right here, this is a 14.5 Criterion barrel. These are accurate barrels. So this scope pairs nicely with this, right? So a couple things I'm going to talk about as it comes to some of the big questions that I know people have are, first of all, 1 to 6 versus 1 to 8 versus 1 to 10, mil versus MOA, second versus first focal plane, all of that stuff. And then I'm going to talk about some ins and outs that people might not really know about, okay? So let's talk about magnification range first, because that's a simple one to check off, all right? I've had 1 to 4s, I've had 1 to 6s, I've had 1 to 8s, and I've played with 1 to 10s, okay? One thing to keep in mind is the further you get magnified out, to my understanding, the more you're pushing through the center of the lens, and the smaller the objective up here, like these are real tiny objectives, the less light that's being gathered, okay? The less clarity and all that. So that's why you see long range scopes that have those big 50mm objectives, because they're capturing more light and it looks clearer, and science, right? So it's important to understand the limitations of that. Is if you have a 10 power and this reticle or this objective lens stays nice and small, that 10 power is not going to look as clear as if you had a big 50mm objective. You're going to get more light transmission, all that. So for me, 1 to 8 is a sweet spot. Played with 1 to 10s. I think those would do well on a DMR. If you're going to be running a 417 or a Scar or some of those, they're going to fit that DMR roll a little bit better to get out to 10. But I think for 5.56, 1 to 8 is plenty, okay? Now, 1 to 4, still a solid option, right? If you're on a budget and you want to get an older 1 to 4 type scope, it's not a bad thing, okay? And especially when we talk about some of the options that you have with first versus second focal plane, all of that, okay? So the next big one is first focal plane versus second focal plane, okay? And I'm going to break down where I like first focal plane, where I like second focal plane. Now, in these low variable power optics, we have 1 power. And what that means is 1 power should be kind of our go-to for close range stuff, right? We have that 1 power, that's what should work for us in whether it's close quarter stuff, whether it's fast and up close engagements, but 25, 50 meters and in, that low power, that 1 power should be ideally good for close target engagements, right? That means snapping the rifle up, being able to shoot fast, get on target. And then when we get up into the higher range of magnification, that's going to be a little more precision and wanting to shoot out to distance, okay? So for this 1 power to 8 or 10 power, and EOTech is the only one that I've really seen that I'll give an exception to with their reticle and the way they made it grow and shrink. But what has been a common theme for me is on 1 power, the optic is too tiny, the reticle is too tiny, and it's hard for me to distinctly pick out with no illumination. And then with illumination on, it gets a little bit better, but we'll talk about another reason that it's tough in a second. And then on max power, you zoom in on that reticle and everything gets really too thick and blocky, especially with like a 6 or an 8 power. 1 to 4, we're a little bit more in that sweet spot. But people have to be really crafty with the way they design this. Another reason that I think first focal plane optics are kind of not conducive to this style is because it doesn't make the best use of 1 power. And I'm going to explain that here in a second. But so that's something to think about, right? That's not an absolute. It's not a, hey, you're stupid if you have a first focal plane. Maybe you have one that I've never looked through that works really, really well and you like it. There's a lot of options out there, right? So here's the big reason to me why if we have a 1 power scope, we want second focal plane. And it's as simple as this. When I turn on my illumination, I don't have to get directly behind the scope in order for that dot to show up. It acts a lot more like a red dot than a first focal plane does. If you don't believe me, grab a first focal plane, check it out. With this one, I can actually see my dot right here. And you can see my reticle is all the way to the left edge of the scope. Is my scope blacked out? Absolutely. But what happens is if I just naturally point the gun and I'm like perceiving my dot to be there, I'm pretty much aiming at that spot that I want to look at, okay? Now, yes, there's an insane amount of parallax shift. It's something you need to think about, but when it comes to shooting targets, 25 meters and in, snapping up quickly, not having to have a perfectly clear scope and no scope shadow and still seeing where you're going to impact. Okay, yes, so the dot makes a huge difference. It's really, really nice. It's super good for this acting more like a red dot. That's not the case with the first focal plane scope. I don't know science-wise if that's because the reticle is etched on a second focal plane back here, and on a first focal plane it's up here, so you have to get more centered up to be able to look through and see it. I don't know. I don't know the science behind it. All I know is as an end user, this comes up a lot quicker, and I don't feel like I need an offset dot for this, because even if I'm at 8 power and I have that reticle on and I'm shooting something far away, and then I snap to something, I can still see black with an illuminated dot, and close targets, I can take that shot. Right? So that's just something for me that I think is a huge, and that's something recently I found out, I think that's a huge advantage to second focal plane, okay? I'm not worried about the reticle growing and shrinking because I'm not trying to do anything insanely precise, okay? So yeah, first focal plane versus second focal plane. Now, when we get into the more advanced stuff, like the higher magnifications where you have 2 to 10s, all those bigger ones, absolutely, I like first focal plane. I think it's way, way better. And the reason is because if we have like a 2 to 10 or a 3 to 14 or something like that, that low end of magnification, it being a 3 power, I would rather have an offset dot. I don't want to shoot up close with 3 power. I'm not as worried about it. That 3 power is going to be more for just identifying targets and then zooming in on it. So I'm more okay with having that offset dot and a higher power scope being first focal plane, because that makes it easier for me to see what's going on big picture, then zoom in, my reticle gets bigger, I see my mills, I see everything I need, and yeah, that's what I prefer for that. But for something like this, quick acquisition, more of a do-all rifle, I like second focal plane, guys. So, talking mill versus MOA, as we're talking about that, what's super important. Mill versus MOA, why did I choose an MOA version of this? And at first I didn't really know why I did. I didn't do the research, I just kind of picked up, I normally like mills, but this was the one that was available at T-Rex, so I grabbed this one. And I hadn't really thought about it until this last trip I went up there and we were shooting some precision. I just went, yeah, MOA doesn't really make sense. This thing is graduated, the hash marks are, 2.5 MOA, 5 MOA, 8.5, and then 12 something MOA. And I was like, it just makes no freaking sense. Well, as I was driving back from shooting, I kind of thought about it and I went, actually, is that a BDC? Is it a rough BDC for like a pick an average load, whether it be green tip out of a 14-inch 14.5? And that's going to get you in the ballpark. And sure enough, I ran it on a ballistic calculator. That's exactly what it is. So it makes a lot of sense. If I'm not going to be dialing, I want to have something that acts as a BDC. Now, why would I steer someone away in this situation from MOA? Well, if you're putting it on something that's just going to be completely different than what this BDC is kind of set up to be, then that's where I would do it. If you're going to throw it on a 10.5 or you're going to throw it on something that is not going to follow the same ballistics as a 5.56 and it doesn't link up at all, I would say mils is going to be easier. You can remember your holes for 1 mil, 2 mil, 3 mils, 4 mils, and be able to go, yes, this is my hole. For this is exactly what this optic was designed for, and it works great. You're basically just going to be able to hold, you're going to be within that area, effective area on 8 power, and it's going to act as a BDC, okay? So, the next thing to talk about, and again, all of that is, it does still come down to preference. It doesn't mean one way is the right way or one way is the wrong way. It's just important to understand the why behind this thing, the pros and cons, so you know your system, you understand the platform that you're running. All right, so the next thing is going to be talking about parallax. Parallax. These scopes, inherently, anything 1 to 6, 1 to 6, 1 to 7, 1 to 8, all these scopes don't have parallax adjustment. What that means is that there's a distance that parallax is just set, okay? Doesn't mean these are parallax free. It means that there's a distance that they picked. They probably picked, hey, this is where it's going to matter more. We want it, usually it's about 200, 250, maybe 300. I don't know, again, the specifications on where parallax is set for this one. But what that means is if you look at a lot of scopes, they have the ability to have an adjustment in their parallax. And I'm going to explain this the really simple way. I'm sorry if I use some of the wrong terms, but basically what that is your ability to put the target you're engaging and your reticle as close together as you possibly can, so that if you deviate left to right, you're not seeing your optic here deviate with your eye. So it's basically your ability to like push your optic out of the same focal plane that your target's on, or as close as you can get, so that it matters less if you're perfectly behind the gun, looking directly through the center of that optic, okay? So these don't have parallax adjustment, and it's another reason why I think they make more so lousy precision scopes. Meaning, I would rather bump up to a 2 to 10 that has the parallax adjustment, that has mils, that's first focal plane, and just put an offset dot on it, because yeah, I'm going to have a little bit more weight, but I have the ability to adjust parallax and to be much more precise and you know, get a higher first round hit probability. Whereas this, without that parallax adjustment, I have to pay attention to make sure I'm directly behind the rifle, spend a little bit more time, which is something I should be doing anyway. But one cool trick that actually Lucas mentioned, I don't know if he knew what he was teaching me or not, but he basically said, yeah, it gets the brightest when you're directly behind the optic. And what that means is you're eliminating your left to right movement. So the illumination, when you turn it on, when I zero the rifle, I actually use the illumination to make sure that it's glowing the brightest when I'm dead center behind the rifle, and that helps eliminate parallax shift. Okay, where you will see this is when you're trying to zero it at 100, it's not, parallax isn't set at 100. So the more you move your thing, you might see your group open up. So if you've ever shot with a 1 to 7, or 1 to 7, if you've ever shot with one of these scopes, and then you're like, why do I shoot a better group with my red dot? That's probably why, because you're getting parallax shift and those red dots compensate for that a lot better than these do. Those are some of the things, guys, that I think make this a really good standalone scope. I don't feel like I need to put an offset red dot on this, simply because with being able to pick up that dot inside there and just transpose it, I feel like it's as fast as a red dot. Okay, so I don't feel the need to roll it over and do this. If you have a first focal plane, then a red dot off the side might make a lot of sense. I am going to be doing a lot more research into 2 to 10 type scopes. That was something that me and Lucas talked about, and I think there's a need for that. I think that there is another tier above this, which is somebody that wants to have a reticle they understand a little bit, wants to be able to mill. The military called it a special purpose receiver that is designed to have a little bit more of a higher magnification on it and an accurized, basically M16, I believe it was. And so I think that, for what a lot of people are looking at, that might be the answer to it, pushing this out to its maximum effective range, increasing your first round hit probability, things like that. And when you get into that realm, I would stop worrying about what a 62 grain green tip. You're going to be looking at shooting some 77 grain match ammunition to kind of pair up with that, that setup. Does that make sense? So I hope you guys found that informative. I hope that that was a good lesson on maybe my philosophy of use behind this setup and why I like it, the way I run it, what I do with it. Sorry it was a little bit lengthy. I'll try and add some B-roll in there, but maybe now you're better informed about going out and purchasing and making some of these decisions, not about what I like, but my time behind the scope, the pros and the cons to it, what I really found to be the best option that way. Or maybe you say, screw it, I like ACOGs, I like the way they can be beat to piss, and they're, it doesn't matter. Just make sure you understand the equipment that you have so you can better implement yourself. It's not always just about, having the Gucci thing that someone says you need to have. It's about understanding your equipment. And that's really, really important. And there's no greater lesson than this guy right here, where I was like, why did I get MOA? And then I went and did the research on it and was like, actually, I like that, and I'm glad I did that. So know your equipment, guys. It's super, super important. Take care.